Couple of smaller ideas. First, two types of receptors for neurotransmitters. Okay? Remember, I had this picture at the bottom, like a bouton picture, right? And I told you that neurotransmitter is going to bind to the receptor. So receptors can be of two types. And I want to explain what happens in each type and how they are different. So receptors can be ionotropic, which is very simple. So you've got neurotransmitter, so you've got a receptor, right? It's a transmembrane protein, and you've got neurotransmitter here. So neurotransmitter will bind to the receptor, and this binding will open an ion channel, okay? Does that make sense? So whatever ion channel is open, let me ask you, I killed that relative concentrations, but you should remember by now. If this is sodium channel, this is outside, this is inside. Where does sodium go? Inside, yes. If it's a potassium channel, where does potassium go? Outside. If it's chloride, chloride inside and calcium inside. That's all. Does that make sense? So,
oh, where do they diffuse?
Where do they diffuse? They diffuse.
Okay. I thought you said where they were.
No. Well, sorry for confusion. Yes, so chloride will go from outside inside. Okay, and that explains. That will explain very soon how neurotransmitters can be inhibitory and how they can be excitatory. We didn't define inhibition and excitation actually yet. We will. Okay, we're good? Second type of the receptor. Now, in the entire CNS, like for today's conversation, this is the only one that we care about. But when we get to sensory, the special senses, vision, taste, and smell, the different type of receptors, so-called metabotropic receptors, will become very important. So what does that mean, metabotropic? This is your first introduction into an idea of so-called second messenger. I'm going to draw something, okay? So this is the membrane, okay? It's membrane. This is the receptor, right? So neurotransmitter binds to the receptor. Is that clear? That binding activates so-called G protein. They really call it G proteins. And this receptor is, you don't need to know that, G protein coupled, GPCR. So this G protein is, when it's activated, the fancy word is translocates. I usually use the word goes and binds to some enzyme. Okay? There are multiple enzymes that can be activated by G protein. Okay? We don't care which ones. It doesn't really matter. For us now, it does not matter. So this activated G protein activates the enzyme. And this activated enzyme starts churning out a molecule. Are you with me? Molecule that is called a second messenger. Okay? So, neurotransmitter binds to the receptor. It activates G protein. G protein goes to the enzyme and activates enzyme, and enzyme starts churning out the second messenger. Second messenger can do a lot of stuff in the cell. We don't really care at this point. Okay? This is the signal. Are we good? Usually compared to like somebody, I'm 6-year-old, somebody rings the doorbell at our apartment, my mom opens. So my mom opens, tells me to go tell my brother that there's a friend at the door. I go to my dad instead and tell my dad, hey, I'm too lazy, can you tell my brother that his friend is waiting at the door? And my dad takes a sleeper and throws at my brother saying your friend's at the door. Okay, so like many steps. Really simple question. Which process of these two is faster? Top one, yeah. So usually this is a rather slow process, and it's involved in many slow responses. This is super fast. Go ahead.
Can you explain the first one?
The first one, molecule of neurotransmitter binds to the receptor that's at the same time is an ion channel. And when it binds, it opens that channel. So this is an example of ligand-gated ion channel. The dongle is a neurotransmitter. The receptor is that little black box on the wall. And the channel is the door. Okay, cool. Questions here? Okay, now, fair warning. We're going to talk about a few concepts that are absolutely abstract. There's going to be a little bit at the end, some hints of clinical relevance, but not much. I love that physiology because it's awesome, but no clinical information. It's hardcore electrophysiology of the nervous transmission. Okay? So, the first concept that we're going to go over is the idea of Nern's potential. This is the theoretical idea. Okay?
What is that word? The N word?
Nernst. N-E-R-N-S-T. It's actually really cool German physicist in the early 20th century. Like, really witty guy. I believe he formulated the second law of thermodynamics. So, here's what we're going to make some assumptions. So, first assumption, basically the only assumption, we're going to imagine for a second that the cellular membrane is permeable, so it has channels only for potassium. Okay? Only potassium can go across the membrane, nothing else can. This is of course not true, but this is the mental experiment. Okay? So, it's permeable. Where does potassium go? From into out, right? So this is your potassium diffusion. I'm not drawing any channels. Okay, just diffusion. So that's potassium diffusion. It's the process that depends on the chemical gradient. Am I clear? How is potassium charged? Positive. So when positive ions leave this area, what kind of charge accumulates here? Negative. So we've got a bunch of negative charges here. And you've got a bunch of positive charges here. What do positive and negative charges do? Attract. Very good. So now, electrical component, electromagnetic component, will start to draw potassium back into the cell. That makes sense? Because, you know, positive potassium want to go back. And at some point, these two flows will cancel each other out. Does it? You understand what I'm saying? My favorite analogy is Black Friday at Walmart, 4 a.m. in the morning. Doors open and everybody rushes in. But then at some point, if you will look at the flow of people, the number of people in the store remains the same. So the flow in and the flow out, they equivalent. Same happens here. So this happens at the certain distribution of charges. That makes sense? This distribution of charges is called, that's the definition of an electrical potential. So an electrical potential at which net flow of ion is 0 is called Nernst potential. Okay? Now, I brag about the fact that I do not ask students to memorize numbers. Yeah, I can tell you, well, first of all, you should tell me. So, Nernst, the potential, in general, the electrical potential across the membrane, is measured inside. So we can take an electrode, stick it in, and measure it. Is Nernst potential for potassium positive or negative? It's not a tricky question. It's like 0 out of 10 question. It's drawn there. If we measure the potential inside the cell, is the potential, huh? We measure, I'm going to give you a second chance. We measure electrical potential inside the cell. Is it positive or negative?
It's negative.
It's negative, that's it. It's drawn here, yeah. So, Nernst potential for potassium is negative. That number's not on the exam. Guaranteed. Negative 90. Okay? Now, what if we do the same story for sodium? Sodium will diffuse how? Outside in. Bringing positive charges in and leaving negative charges outside. Where do we measure the potential? We'll always measure inside. I saw it. You can take an electrode and physically stick it into the cell. This is basically an agreement. The agreement is, let's stick an electrode in the cell and we'll always measure potential in the cell. So, Nernst potential for sodium is positive or negative? Positive. That makes sense? Now, do we have other ions? We do. Calcium, chloride, phosphate, sulfate, carbonate, magnesium. We don't care. Because they play virtually no role in the distribution of electrical charges across the membrane. So first, kind of a big statement. The only two ions that form what we call a, I'm going to put it in a different color, resting membrane potential potassium and sodium. That's it. Now look at the numbers. Like you look ahead. For potassium, that individual potential is negative 90. For sodium, it's plus 60. So what should we do? We should just put them together, right? That makes sense? Like seriously, I'm not kidding, I'm not joking. We should just put them together. Practically, yes. But the deal is, potassium is more important than sodium. So its role is higher. If we would just put negative 90 and plus 60, we would get negative 30. But since sodium doesn't play that much of a role, are you following me? Then potassium is more important. And the resting membrane potential is approximately negative 70 millivolts. So you can see that potassium is the most critical. Well, I can give actually a clinical relevance here. Not for the exam, but just to kind of cheer you up a little bit. We're talking about transmission of a signal in a neuron, right? And it's going to be an electrical signal, right? And potassium is the most important ion to maintain that electrical potential on the membrane. That makes sense? So potassium is absolutely crucial for all nerve signal transmission, for muscle contraction. It's really, really important. What is the method of capital punishment in the United States? Just in some states. In most states, it's a lethal injection. And what's the lethal injection? What kills people in lethal injection? Potassium chloride. It causes the ventricular fibrillation of the heart. Just massive dose of potassium chloride because it creates such an imbalance that electrical activity just goes haywire. Make sense? Good? I tend to rate my questions on like scale of like out of 10. About 3-4 out of 10. An interesting question that I want to ask. Imagine that you have a hypothetical ion. We don't have to give a name. Which concentrations inside the cell and outside the cell are the same. Make sense so far? What is the Nern's potential for such ion? Sure. We have a hypothetical ion which concentrations inside the cell and outside of the cell are the same. What's the Nern's potential for that ion? It's not a very complicated question. Huh? Yes. That's it. Because there's no flow.
Oh.
It's zero, right? There is no redistribution of charges. It just basically stays where it is. There's no gradient, there is no electrical, but that's so, yeah. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that's the thing about knowing so much information. You think it's really more than what it is, but it never really be. Like,
Say again?
that makes sense.
Overthinking.
Yeah,
Oh!
you overthink it, yeah.
Yeah. Do not.
Yeah.
And look, if I tell you the question that I say, it's like 3 out of 10, most of the question, well, almost maybe except one question that I ask in like 2 courses, they do not require any previous knowledge. They're all based on what we just discussed. You just have to look at it from the slightly different angle. That makes sense?